Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Marjorie Childress. I'm the managing editor at New Mexico In Depth, and I'm joined by our executive director, Trip Jennings. And this is part of our we just thought we would have weekly chats about the legislative session as a way to just offer what offer our insights and kind of baked in knowledge of the legislature to folks. So why don't we just kick off? We have actually been talking about what's happening at the federal level, though, at the beginning of every one of these, because we know it's what's on people's minds. So we're going to start there. And Trip, I'm going to let you kind of kick us off talking about what you're thinking about this week.
Yeah, thanks. First, it's we need to acknowledge that New Mexico is heavily dependent on federal funds. This is why it's something that's on our minds as reporters and journalists who've been covering the legislature for a long time. But also, you need to know that the governor and the lawmakers are thinking a great deal about this because looking at past budgets, state budgets, you will see, if you know where to go in the state budget, you'll see that, over the past 10 years, the state of New Mexico has relied on the federal government to the tune of about 40% of the budget. So this is something that is part of our, job, as it were. And I'll be honest with you, we're 4 weeks into the new administration, and it's still difficult to figure out what's happening at the federal level because there's so much happening. I know that Marjorie, you've written a newsletter and also I think a post that went up on our site about, hey, federal layoffs. We don't know how the layoffs are going to affect New Mexico. Again, we're heavily dependent on, there are many tens of thousands of federal employees. We don't know how they're going to be affected by layoffs. I think some of these layoffs are in the courts right now, but we did have a national kind of layoff of probationary employees last week.
Mhm.
So there
Yes,
are people affected by that.
there
The
was
other
a
thing-
rally at the Roundhouse about it, and
yeah,
with a lot of the
yeah.
federal workers, I think, came to that. And I've known people who've been personally affected. I think, many New Mexicans might because it is a big part of our workforce in the state. And I just want to say on this, so there's been this layoff of probationary employees, which is a lot of the times these folks who are kind of the younger, the coming into federal agencies. There are people who are recruited for their expertise into federal agencies, but it's also to me that these probationary employees represent this kind of emerging, the early career folks. And so I think there's real questions around, particularly in New Mexico, how these layoffs will affect, our our forests and our landscapes, our public lands, because it's a big part of our state. And a lot of these folks maintain those spaces. They do clearing in national forests, and they actually, so it's more than just firefighting. So I think there
Wasn't
are questions. And the other thing I heard is, I think it's becoming, it's actively being discussed, is that this is probably just the beginning, that they might do a more formal reduction of force process
hmm
across
hmm
federal government as well. So, and we don't really know how this is going to impact New Mexico, give it from an economic perspective.
Yeah, I want to say too some of the national media have correctly, I think, characterized the probationary kind of layoffs as, it's kind of like eliminating the next generation of leaders, frankly, in many ways. There are other people who are caught up in the layoffs as
Mhm.
well, who are not necessarily, they might have moved into new jobs in the last, year or two. That is something and that we also need to consider because I think that probably is happening as well. The other thing I want to say is that as someone who's covered multiple, you know, criminal public corruption investigations at the federal level and at the state level. I'm also watching the it's DOGE, Department of, and now I'm blanking on what DOGE means, DOGE, Government Efficiency, Department of
Yeah.
Government Efficiency. And they are coming out with announcements that they're saving so much money, hundreds of billions of dollars. They're saying that there are 150-year-olds collecting Social Security benefits. And I'm just one person. Marjorie, you're just one person, but we both have some experience with this. To find corruption, it's going to take a long time to find that, by which I mean there are trained veteran investigators who are looking into stuff. Then they actually talk to the attorneys who have a great knowledge of U.S. criminal statutes and civil statutes, and at the state level, criminal statutes and civil statutes at the state level. And then you also, in some cases, when you're talking about like public corruption, you have forensic accountants. And so this can take years. So for a Department of Government Efficiency to come out within 3 weeks of beginning its work, saying that they found this much waste, corruption and whatnot, it's more. I'm going to editorialize here, but that's more of a marketing campaign than it is an actual investigation. People need to be mindful of this, and I'm not. This is not a partisan or ideological argument I'm making. This is more of like I have experience with these kind of investigations. You've seen these as well. And we have to be we have to be careful about believing some of the memes coming out of.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's true. I mean, I think that the example that I really kind of focused in on, I mean, I tend to like focus heavily at the state level. I'm trying to like protect my headspace around some of this.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but I saw the piece around, this idea that people who are 150 years old were receiving Social Security checks. And then what I think you shared an article with me, and then I've since read a lot about kind of the fact that our federal agencies, some of them are still using a really old
Yeah.
computer
Yes.
programming language called COBOL. And that was like
Remember that, guys?
that was like a blast from the past for me because, in the early 90s, late 80s, coming up, that was the computer programming language. And I remember this because I was in that time of my life, I had a lot of people who were pursuing careers in computer programming um and it's astounding to me on some level that our federal agencies are still using that language. But then I was reading some analysis that yes, it's a problem in a way because it's increasingly difficult to find people who know how to use that programming language. But at the same time, it's proven to be very resilient and like it's that these systems are that they're secure and safe. And so this idea what is that these young folks are coming in, these Doge guys, and do they even know what they're looking at? um, that the 150 could just be this automatic thing that's filling in these blanks,
Right, which is what they're theorizing, right?
like that, like it's based on lack of birth dates or whatnot. And
Yes.
so what's striking to me about it is putting out these kind of really, these statements that everyone's like, oh my gosh, but there's no backup. We can't see for ourselves like where they're getting that information and what it's based on. And that gets to what you're speaking to,
It,
which is
I
that
mean,
it
yeah.
takes time to figure these things out.
I mean, I also smile, Marjorie, because we as an organization have worked with data at various levels,
Mhm.
with ProPublica on a couple of situations, but also our organizational internally. And I mean, from simple Excel spreadsheets to much larger data sets. And I am commenting on social media sometimes when I see these memes. Especially around the Social Security benefits that you were just talking about, 150-year-olds. It's one of the first things you learn in data is if it's too easy, it probably is. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. You need to go back and check your assumptions. You need to go back and look at the parameters of the data set. You need to figure out what questions the data set is answering because these data sets are created by human beings and they had certain, this is about logic. And so when you see stuff like this, uh, I'm just going to talk about journalism. I'm not talking about government investigators. It's like, oh, okay, let's take a breath. Let's go back and look at this. And that seems not to have happened in this situation, which this is
Well, we
probably
don't
why I
really
say that.
know. I mean, yes, it doesn't. It seems too quick to us. But at
Yeah.
the same time, I will say, I think that I think there are incredible privacy and security concerns on our
Oh
hand.
yeah, sure.
But at the same time, there could be some interesting information that comes out of all of this. So, I mean,
Yeah. I mean,
uh,
I
I'm
mean,
not completely like naysaying the need to go into federal agencies and really look at have an independent team look at the data, but I think a
right.
more deliberate, longer term process could be good. Uh,
I'm with you totally. I say this? The AP just published a story this morning saying around the Social Security benefits issue that a Social Security Administration IG did find you know, of the $8.6 trillion sent out over several years, there was $71 billion sent out incorrectly. And there are reasons, I mean, they're looking through that, but it took some time to figure out that
mhm.
71 billion also sounds like a big number. It is a big number, but it's much less than 1% of all the money that went out, which, I want to let's bring this back to New Mexico. More than 10 years ago, we had an administration saying that there was 33 to 36 million dollars in possible Medicaid fraud in the behavioral health system. What ultimately came out of that was it was there was no Medicaid fraud. Everybody was cleared, and the
Yeah.
overbilling was, I mean, infinitesimal. So you have to be careful about these kind of
Right.
things.
That's a really good example here in that the state of New Mexico has that 2013 when they pulled the plug like that
Yeah.
based on this one audit. I mean, it's a really good example of the damage that you can create.
Yeah, you can create a lot of damage if you're not really careful.
Mhm.
So
So
yeah.
so let me also just say to folks who have joined us, thanks for joining us. And we would love for you to drop in questions or comments into the Q&A function. And just tell us what you're thinking or want to know from us. And we'll be monitoring that throughout this conversation. I should have said that at the beginning, but so the other thing that I've been brewing on a lot, Trip, at the federal level, I think Trump, in part, won because he zeroed in on affordability and inflation. I think, what people are saying, it's the price of eggs. Some people are like kind of just being, in part, it's the price of eggs is one of the main reasons why he won. And since he's come into office, it hasn't really seemed like that's been a huge part of his talking points. Because he's a big talking points kind of guy. Well, he's a big talker. But he's really focused on other things like now it's Gaza. It's taking over Gaza. It's today it's Zelensky is a dictator and started the war against Putin. It's renaming the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. It's taking over Greenland. It's slapping major tariffs on trading partners. But
Reducing the federal workforce. I mean, that's
yeah,
another.
reducing the federal workforce, giving tax cuts. I think that's probably what that's in favor to service to, which may get at affordability, give people more money in their pockets to spend, but it doesn't seem oriented towards reducing inflation. Um, I've been watching kind of this state. There's a kind of concurrent kind of or a state effort. We've talked a little bit about it around progressive taxation, the agenda over the last 3 or 4 years. This week, the House Democrats basically sent out a whole list of bills that is their affordability package, which I thought was super interesting um, that they are framing it in that way. I mean, obviously, it could be all politics, but when I review the list, there seems to be some really substantive proposals that they have, and because they sent it out as a package like this, I kind of feel like a lot of these measures probably have real juice.
Mm, mm. I mean, because they have backers, right? A very, very powerful legislative backers, including
Uh-huh.
legislative leaders, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the like House leaders in particular.
Yeah.
So some of those are, they have a proposal to raise the minimum pay for school staff. They would stop employers from taking credit card fees out of the wages of tipped workers. So that's all the folks out there who get so let's say so I routinely when I go out to restaurants and me and my husband and whoever else, we will try to give tips in cash because we know that if we give the tip on the credit card, it might be reduced. We suspect it might be reduced by the restaurant or the bar or whatnot. And some of the restaurants and bars apparently take out the credit card fees out of the out of the tips.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think this bill is targeted at that. There's a bill that would eliminate unfair pricing by ticket resellers, which is kind of interesting. I mean, in the old school, we would call that what would you scalping.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now it's all online, and if anyone who's gone and tried to like buy a ticket for one of these reselling sites, which is often the only place that you can buy them, astronomical. Some of the prices are astronomical. Um, they would establish a commission to study and make recommendations on how to reduce grocery store prices and improve local supply chain issues.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's establishing a commission, you know, I mean, we don't know how far those go always, but it really does speak to that there's awareness here of eggs, the price of eggs and whatnot. And they would prohibit grocery and retail stores from using so-called dynamic pricing. That is the one I found really interesting because there's a trend, I don't know if you've noticed it, of literally some of these stores have electronic price tags
Hmm. Okay.
and they will change their pricing based on holidays, when they know there's going to be higher demand for a particular item. This is the kind of thing that I mean, this happens in other sectors, I believe, but this bill would eliminate that for grocery stores.
Now I'm going to go to my local neighborhood grocery store and look for those. I'm not, I mean, in some ways, I'm not also at all surprised that grocery stores would now be part of this much larger trend of using, as we've seen with the rise of social media and everything else, which is much faster information coming into the system,
Mm-hmm.
being able to alter
Prices really quick.
pricing,
Mhm.
which has been happening on actually, I'm going to combine it with Wall Street, but that's been happening on Wall Street for a couple of decades with
Yeah.
the increase of technology, which is, people can get in there and within nanoseconds or microseconds and change stuff. So I'm not all that surprised, but now I know maybe to go look at I didn't know to look at that.
Well,
So
I mean, I don't think it's like broadly that they're doing, but they are changing out pricing pretty, quickly these days.
mm,
I think this speaks to, in some ways, a basic good that people rely on,
mhm,
and being able to like plan your weekly budget or whatnot, or your
mhm.
monthly budget around the cost of food, um, and then going to the grocery store and having sticker shock on it. There are,
Yeah.
I mean, there are other types of places that do dynamic pricing. Ski resorts these days are doing dynamic pricing,
Mm,
which has
mm.
led to incredibly more expensive ski tickets if you're into skiing.
You know more about that than it's been a decade and a half since I've skied. So
Yeah. Well, I mean,
keep me
so
up
in
on
the
that.
old days, you could just go see what the lift ticket was going to be in a given year.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
now in some of these ski resorts that are adjacent to really large cities or within striking range of large cities, it's changing all the time based
I,
on demand.
I do think that this is really interesting, and I'm going to point out that what I think a possible response maybe from the GOP lawmakers up at the state would be you being the Democrats, especially this newly in the last half decade emboldened kind of progressive majority, are able to do this because of the oil and gas industry. That's what I've heard. We've heard this over and over again over the years. Whether that's true or not, I mean, we'll leave that to the lawmakers to have that debate and whatnot. But this money, what we're talking about, in some ways, um, it will cost money to do some of this stuff to the general fund.
Like
And
grocery tax and whatnot,
what's that?
just based on like the taxes.
Yeah, because every time there is a tax deduction or a tax credit, that is a tax expenditure that, sorry, this is nerdy stuff, but that is money that you're taking out of the state general fund.
Mhm.
Um, Again, we'll let that debate be had by folks on, all sides. But
Yeah, definitely. And so some of these other measures in here, so there is a whole section on protecting renters,
hmm,
which I think this particular section of this package is it could have really positive impacts for lower income people searching for rental housing. Because as you know, I mean, we have a kind of a housing crisis. We have a housing
hmm,
crisis. And it's
hmm.
people can't afford to get into rental properties or to purchase a home these days. And so there's a whole set of bills here that would require a change in how certain landlords or agencies operate. So, like on income screening, um, so a lot of landlords screen you for can you afford to pay their rent on a regular basis? And they'll do a
Hmm.
ratio of your rent, the rent price to your income. So this measure would require them to actually reduce the rent price by any kind of government supports that the people get for the housing, like vouchers or whatnot. And it would require them to use more than just their salary, but also any other types of income they get.
Oh, okay.
So it's a real kind of technical stuff like that that would hopefully make more people qualify under these income screening measures.
I mean, this is that. Sorry, Marjorie, I didn't mean to interrupt, but like, as someone who we both have done some tax code stuff over the years, around tax expenditures, but also renting and stuff. We've also had some stories over the years about that. Whenever people talk about the technical stuff, I get kind of excited because I didn't, it helps me understand things a little better in reporting on or editing stories coming out of the legislature. So that's interesting. That's
hmm And then they would expunge eviction records after 5 years.
interesting.
A lot of landlords, or people who want to rent, their property will that's a mark against a renter if they've had an eviction in the past, including if someone tried to evict them and couldn't actually do it. I mean, if those records are still hanging out in the.
Are there any? I mean, I'm as you're talking, I'm sitting back thinking about Matthew Desmond's tome of a book called Evicted, which is looking at the larger landlord tenant kind of situation across the U.S. And many. I mean, as I think about this, and I'm not acknowledging what you're saying, but sometimes there are landlords who are corporations or whatever, and they're managed. But then there are also landlords who are smaller and they just own a building. And I
Mhm.
mean, I'm wondering how this might affect those folks too, which is in some ways,
Mhm.
I think these bills probably are. I don't know if they're targeted at any type of landlord, but I would imagine it's more of the larger firms and whatnot. I don't know.
I think there's exceptions. I mean, I can go read these a little bit more closely, which I need to do.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. It's just
No.
interesting.
But I mean, to see if they make those distinctions. I mean, there's another bill that would forbid renting to someone based on their source of income, and that gets at things like you can't discriminate against someone just because they use a government voucher, like a
Mm-hmm.
like a Section 8
Mm-hmm.
voucher. So that would be in this package if they
It
were able
becomes
to.
a revenue, all forms of revenue.
And
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's probably people out there who avoid renting to people because that is a signal to people for on something we don't know. And then the other big part of this protecting renters package is to not allow landlords, and I think this one gets at the bigger agency thing, is to not use artificial intelligence programs or companies that use artificial intelligence programs and then provide you market analysis that suggests to you the level of rent that you can charge and
Oh.
you can get.
Mm.
There's
Mm.
been some national, I think, a lawsuit around this saying it's collusion and rent fixing, basically, and that's what's inched up rental prices for people is like
Mm.
um, an unfair kind of collusion to keep rental prices high. So I think some of these are really substantive. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it'd be really interesting to see if they pass. And Caleb Blanchard wants to know. Can you share the bill number or link to read the affordability package? Kayla, what I will do is I will drop in this list in the chat. I don't have just a list of bill numbers, but I'll drop in the list from what we received from Democrats, House Democrats, calling this their affordability package. Um, I'll do that in just a second. And then the final thing is they tackle healthcare, and they had
Mm.
a bill that would implement a state administered Medicaid forward plan, which is huge. It would be huge if they, I think, if they were to get this passed. And this, I think, really speaks to what you're talking about in terms of all the oil and gas revenue we have in the state. That, I've been thinking about this a lot in light of the federal, what's happening at the federal level, as grants are pulled back and less spending's possibly coming from the feds, is that in New Mexico, we do have these budget surpluses right now. So it's possible that lawmakers can do something. But the
What is,
well, the
sorry.
Medicaid forward plan, I'm not an expert on this, but it was basically, it would be a plan to provide medical assistance by January 1st, 2028 to state residents who are under age 65 and not otherwise eligible for and enrolled in mandatory coverage or optional full Medicaid coverage under the
Mm.
Medicaid state plan. And then
Mhm.
there's some income levels that people have to meet for variations of eligibility for this program.
How would they pay for it? Is it another trust fund kind of idea?
Um, I'm not sure on that part. So
Because
the
in
bill would appropriate $2 million to develop the plan, develop
Mm.
the program, and then it's supposed to be implemented by 2028.
I mean, the thing that's really interesting is that they are increasingly, because the state leaders do know at some point that oil and gas, the historic just rise in oil and gas revenues at some point will run out. Or it will go back to historical kind of like averages where you got a boom bust and stuff like this. And so they are creating trust funds that by which they will pull the interest from the corpus and help pay for programs and services. And I do, as you're talking about this, it does seem I've not seen anybody write this at the national level, but I'm sure that some of the trade orgs that are covering Medicaid and whatnot probably are sitting here thinking about this. Think about the Medicaid expansion of the last decade through the ACA, or what, is more commonly known as Obamacare. It
Hmm.
expanded Medicaid across the nation. It expanded our roles here in New Mexico. And I think in some ways probably the federal administration is looking to ways to how to get back to pre-ACA levels, or maybe even less than that. This is just speculation on my part. But we were all over the expansion here in Mexico in depth. I mean, all over what the expansion meant here in New Mexico, what it looked like, what the exchange looked like, who would be covered, how much money it would cost.
Hmm.
And so as you're talking about this, that's a really substantive piece of legislation. I think there's going to be a lot of debate around it.
Yeah, so Kirsten Hansen says, I think the tricky part of Medicaid is that it's all linked to federal funding from Medicaid. So what I did notice in the
Yes.
fiscal impact report for the bill, which I do need to read more closely, is that this is one of the state agencies, and said, look, there's federal uncertainty
Yes.
around the Medicaid dollars we get now. I mean, in New Mexico, we've always kind of benefited from a 3-to-1 match, which means that for every dollar New Mexico spends, the federal government gives us three for
Yeah,
Medicaid.
yeah. That's exactly right.
We don't know what the future is going to be. I mean, I think so much is up in the air,
So
with
dynamic. Yes.
the
That's
Trump
correct.
administration talking about just doing like kind of block grants to the states. So yeah, there's a lot up in the air. I would be very surprised if this bill passed this session. But I think it's an interesting one.
Can I just step in and say that, we're talking about Medicaid. Medicaid's a very large portion of I mean, not as large as public education, which is the largest single thing, but Medicaid's that's the single largest expenditure. But Medicaid's a rather sizable part of the federal government. And if you look at, and this is something, if you look at the state government and what often we in the media talk about, hey, the state budget is $10.9 billion. You will see if you look in the budget and go to like the line that says, state expenditures and then federal funds, you'll see that the state budget actually is more like, 28, $29 billion, which speaks to the 3-to-1 match on Medicaid and other things. And part of the reason that we get 3-to-1 match is because we are a poor state compared to many other states.
Right.
That's part of the reason. And so this uncertainty is, yeah, what kind of trust fund would you need if that's how you pay for it? How large would it have to be to create enough money to help pay for this Medicaid forward thing? That's a really tricky question. Yeah.
Yeah, good question. So Trip, should we move on in the interest of time? We
I
wanted
don't
to.
know, man. I love this stuff,
I
but yeah,
know.
yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah, we probably should, but I find this stuff really
Mhm.
interesting. But yes, we should move on.
Well, let's talk briefly about the alcohol bill,
Yeah, yeah.
and then move on to talking about the legislature, just kind of some of the bills that would change the legislature. So there's a bill that has been introduced, and I believe it had its first committee hearing this morning. I wasn't able to watch, so I don't know what happened. But it's a bill that would increase the state alcohol tax. It would increase the retail price by 6%. It would add a 6% tax to retail price. So let's say you go out and you buy a six pack of beer, it would add a 6% tax to
Well, I
that.
mean, what I saw in the bill, let me ask you this. It's by volume, like gallon or 6% on a gallon or 6% on light, right? Is that right? No?
Um,
No, I saw six. Okay.
so there's right now our alcohol is taxed by volume. So
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
basically that means, uh stores pay, it's like kind of like a wholesale tax. They pay,
I apologize. I was thinking about the other bill. I apologize. There's
so
another
they-
bill.
yeah, and they pay a price based on the volume of the
Yeah,
alcohol.
yeah, right. Sorry, I apologize. Yeah.
Yeah. To then sell to the consumer. And bills in past years, the lawmaker advocates and the broader coalition that is behind them initially, the first bill that got introduced a couple of years ago wanted to raise that to the equivalent of 25 cents a drink.
Yeah, right.
Um, there was some pushback on that idea from another
Um,
lawmaker. There was some pushback on that idea from another set of lawmakers who said,
yeah.
look, we have an opportunity. This is my interpretation of the argument. We have an opportunity, since we're talking about alcohol taxes, to get rid of this mechanism where we tax it by volume, which is doesn't make sense. It's not a good way to tax anything. And it is actually a regressive tax because it doesn't differentiate between the different types of alcohol that people consume.
Mhm, mhm.
And we should instead just do a retail tax, which is a tax on the price of the bill in restaurants, bars, convenience stores, whatnot, that you when you just go out as a consumer. And the folks who wanted to increase the price on the wholesale side said, look, in the long run, that would reduce the price, or that would effectively, their argument was, we believe that would reduce the price of lower cost alcohol,
Mhm,
which
mhm.
we aren't on board for. While it might increase the higher price alcohols over here, it would be detrimental because the whole purpose of this is to raise the price of alcohol that people consume to try to curb the high rate of alcohol related deaths that we have in the state.
Yeah, using tax stuff to alter human behavior basically
Yeah.
I mean, that's fundamentally what is the goal.
I mean, people call these kind of colloquially, people call these, and it's kind of a derogatory term, syntaxes.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, sure. Yeah.
I've never really bought into that kind of notion that much. I don't think it's a sin to drink, you
No,
know.
right. Yeah.
Um, it's not a sin to drink sugary beverages or whatnot, but it just gets at the larger public health issues around the health detriments of some of the things that we do. And the fact that taxes are used all the time across all areas to shape public policy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, these two sets of lawmakers have now come together after what I think of as last year in particular, a pretty intense debate around
Mhm.
how to raise alcohol taxes. And they have a unified bill now. and it would simply add 6% to the retail price. So if you go out to a bar or a restaurant and you want to order a drink, a beer, glass of wine, or whatnot, 6% will be added to the cost of that. And so it will raise, I think, something around $49 million a year, something like that. And and then they create a new fund, an alcohol harms alleviation fund. They bring in the excise tax that now currently goes to the general fund. They stop sending it to the general fund. They bring it into this, and it goes out to treatment and prevention programs because this state historically, we've done a lot of treatment on alcohol, but we haven't done much prevention. So, I know it's been an interesting debate to follow.
Yeah. Nordy Kalishman says, well, thank you, Nordy. Yes. I mean, we did do a very large a series of stories back in 2022 about the state leading the nation in alcohol related deaths. And
Yeah.
this has kind of sparked this whole conversation around how to deal with this, the deaths, and also if you're someone who is a finance person who looks at public finance and you think about the long tail of the healthcare in this country, if you prevent certain behaviors on the front end when you're young and whatnot and alter it somehow, you will affect the health outcomes in later on years because a lot of money is spent on health outcomes that have basically, I mean, behaviors that have led to behavioral health outcomes. Like a lot of the things that we found, Ted Alcorn, who was the reporter on this, a lot of this alcohol-related death stuff is not DWI. It's long-term kind of like diseases that come from alcohol
It's
ingestion.
chronic diseases, it's DWI, and it's also violence.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
role
that's right. That's
plays
right.
in violence. So at the federal level, some of these kind of researchers and institutions have created they have a way of uh, pulling together a metric called alcohol related deaths. And it brings in a lot of these different ways that alcohol contributes to death.
Yeah, yeah.
And it cannot be overstated how off the charts this stat is for New Mexico. I wish we had the graph in front of us right now. I mean, if you look at a graph of like the 50 states, and you go from the lowest alcohol related deaths, well, New Mexico's on the far side, detrimental side
Hmm.
of that. And the line goes up. And then when you get to New Mexico, it just shoots up. So
Yeah.
there's real harms in the state. And a lot of people drink, I mean, ourselves included. And so this isn't like about prohibition or anything like
No,
that.
no, no. Right. I want to add that in addition to the Alcohol Harms Alleviation Fund, there would be a new tribal alcohol harms alleviation fund as
Mhm.
well.
Right.
As I want to go back to this just in case people missed it. In as part of our series, there was a story that we did about, the myth about drinking habits and stuff like this. And it kind of knocked that myth down about certain populations. Uh,
Right.
so, so
I mean,
anyway,
the key, one of the key takeaways from that article, which was an article about this idea that, because McKinley County, which has a really high proportion of its population are indigenous people, that indigenous people somehow have a bigger problem with alcohol. And really what Ted found from looking at all the data was that actually indigenous people drink less than
Mhm.
groups, but they tend to experience the harms at higher rates, like just all of the associated harms, which are there's a multitude of factors that go into.
Yeah, a lot of factors that go in those health outcomes.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's just really, it's
mhm,
all the stuff that many of us began to. I think we were already aware of this stuff because of who we are and what we've done as an organization in journalism. But it's something that a lot of people maybe for the first time had thought about because of COVID, because you had all these things that were underlying conditions that led to, some
mhm,
terrible
mhm,
outcomes in COVID.
right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to track this bill. And, another kind of note that was made in the fiscal impact report, which we also made in our reporting that Ted did in the package that we did, which I think I want to mention it every time that we talk about this because things become so singularly focused on this tax proposal. But that is not the be all end all. It's when research says it's a really good intervention. But like in the FIR, there was this one point that, like I just mentioned, the state does very little prevention work around alcohol. So this alcohol harms alleviation fund and the taxes that are raised to go into it, hopefully then can be funneled into a wider array of programming that will help, many other ways to help people manage the role that alcohol plays in their lives, basically. Um, and it'll be interesting. So
Yeah.
should we move on in the
I
interest
mean, I
of?
mean, we should acknowledge, and this is where I made the mistake earlier, that there is a bill that's been filed that's competing.
Oh, yes, there
Yeah,
is and I haven't had a chance to really look at that or.
me either. But it is by volume. That's where I made the mistake. I had been looking at this before
Uh-huh.
the Zoom, and they want to increase the rate by which volume is taxed. Uh,
What's interesting about that bill is it has both a Democrat and a Republican sponsor. So we will go read that and kind of see what's up there. I mean, it is probably bears saying that the bill, this kind of consensus bill that is being probably has legs this session.
yes.
It would raise the cost of alcohol in the service industry, in the restaurant and convenience stores. And so I imagine that constituency is not going to be too thrilled by it. But
Mhm.
for the large distributors like Budweiser and the wine companies, all of these companies that sell by volume, it will not be a tax increase for them. And that the effective tax by volume on alcohol in this state hasn't gone up in decades. It
So
has.
you're saying that the bill that kind of I would, at the risk of saying this, consensus bill that has emerged would not raise the taxes on some of these folks, whereas maybe this other one probably would
Well, that's
actually.
been one of the big debates. I mean, so they
Yeah,
call
yeah.
it it's the excise tax goes on alcohol. The
Yes.
alcohol that say I have a restaurant and I go and I buy a case of wine or a big volume amount of alcohol. There's a tax on the volume, the amount of the alcohol, the physical amount of the alcohol
Mhm.
that gets levied, and that's a tax that the distributors are very focused on. And
Mhm.
that tax has not um, been raised. It hasn't been raised in like 30 years. Whereas, but the amount of money they're able to charge for that alcohol has continued to go up. Um,
Yeah, and so we're talking about, having the tax on the wholesalers as it has been for decades.
mhm.
Whereas this consensus bill wouldn't necessarily change that, but
uh,
it would change what like you and I pay.
what
If I
we pay.
Yeah, if I
Mhm.
go to the grocery store and I mean Albuquerque, there's some really good brewers in Albuquerque, so I'll pick up a 4 pack. And so I'd have to pay, if it's $10, I'd have to pay 60 cents more is basically if that
Yeah,
that.
6%. And that is the point, is to raise the end cost for the consumer with this idea that it will lessen.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I just want to make sure I was understanding you correctly. Yeah. Okay.
so why
Yeah.
don't we talk,
Yeah.
well, I mean, I don't know. Do you have to wrap up? I think you have to wrap up, right?
No, I don't. I have a little extra time.
All right.
Today.
Okay, so folks keep weighing in. Any more questions and comments? We're here for them. We do want to talk about legislative process and legislative structure. And so if you want to nerd out with us on that,
Because we're
there's
all about nerding out at New
yeah.
Mexico Tech.
So there's a package of bills. There's a couple of bills that Representative Matthew McQueen has introduced that would change. It would really change the legislative process. These two bills. One would I put it in my newsletter this morning, if you guys got it. One would change our session links. Right now, they're 30. There's a 2-year arc, and you have a 60-day session in one year, and then you have a 30-day session in the other. In the 60-day session, lawmakers can introduce anything they want, on any subject they want. And in the 30-day session, they're limited to budget bills or what the governor says they can introduce. He would scrap all that and he would just say, look, every year we're going to have a 45-day session and lawmakers can introduce any bill that they want in both of those sessions. And to make it manageable, kind of another resolution that would goes with it really is to limit lawmakers to introducing 5 bills each.
I heard the collective gasp up in Santa Fe. You said that.
On the 5 bill limit.
Yes. Yeah, and there's something else that was in your newsletter, which is wouldn't it one of these bills, wouldn't it move the like right now, tomorrow is the end, this is the deadline for introducing bills.
Hmm.
Tomorrow is it's like halfway through it that's the deadline for introducing bills.
Yeah.
And what often happens is you have a flurry of bills around that date called dummy bills, which
Yeah.
have a certain header, which you fortunately, because I always forget this, like what it is, but fortunately in your newsletter, you have the exact language by which we can identify, dummy bills. And I always know to look for that, like public welfare, health, and whatever, but I don't know the actual string of stuff. But your newsletter touched on that too.
Well, he has another bill that he called just a cleanup bill. And I talked to him about this. So the way it's written now, he would get rid of the deadline, the bill introduction deadline. And he says this is because if you change the length of the sessions, um, that bill deadline as it's currently in statute or whatnot is not workable.
Right.
So he was just his initial bill is just like, get rid of the deadline. And really that would to me that means you don't really need dummy bills because you could just introduce any bill up to the last day of the session. But he told me that he was going to amend that bill to put a deadline back in because it just wouldn't be manageable
Oh,
really.
okay.
So just the rationale though for all of this, which I think it makes a lot of sense to me from having watched the frantic nature of the like gushing bills every session and how so many of them just don't see the light of day. He said that, changing it from a 60 to 30 would, create a manageable time period of 45 days every year, and that it would allow lawmakers who in a 60-day session are running bills that they really work hard on. It's like their kind of thing. But he said the current system where they only have that 60-day session every 2 years interrupts their momentum. Their coalition of supporters might break apart. They have new lawmakers they have to educate. And so changing it to where they can keep that momentum going every year is, from his point of view, like would really improve the process. And on the 5 bill limit, he was arguing that right now some lawmakers they introduce 20 to 30 bills apiece, and they just don't have the capacity to get up to speed on all those bills in a way that they need in order to educate other lawmakers and actually push the bill forward. So,
Yeah. I mean, the thing that you and I know after, just watching and observing and being up at the Roundhouse for so many years is that, yeah, people can talk about the lawmaking process in the abstract. But a lot of this, when he talked about momentum, education, new lawmakers, or building, going back to previous supporters, and one, something might have changed, in the last 2 years.
mm,
This is a very people to people kind of, it's really people to people kind of like situation up there, which is um, people learn, there are people who will work across the aisle, Democrats with Republicans, Republicans and Democrats. Oftentimes they've learned that this other person they can trust, they can work with. There's there there's all sorts of ways that this is a very human institution. So I love when you got that from him, elicited that from
yeah.
him, because it
Yeah. There's
that
also,
kind of,
he's also speaking to the need to educate people. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
totally.
bills don't often just go up there and pass in the first year because
No. Yeah.
you have to educate people. It's the legislative process. I mean, I have really learned this in the years I've watched the state houses. You need to get people up to speed on the issues. And so this is the one kind of drawback to his proposal, I think, this 5 bill limit. Um, is there are a lot of bills that get introduced up there, and really, I kind of think the goal is just to have a committee discussion on some of these,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like a way to just start educating people around something, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, I think if that bill were to get any momentum up there, there would be a lot of give and take over what that limit should be. Because in that educational process, it builds over the years, and we've seen this. We've seen how over time, more and more lawmakers get on board with a particular initiative because they've had the time over a period of years to learn about it, talk to their constituents about it,
Mm-hmm.
go back home and digest it, do all
Mm-hmm.
the work that they need
Mm-hmm.
to do to get up to speed on it.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I I really like peeling back the curtain um on the lawmaking process, and he was in some ways doing this about building momentum, because you spend any time up at the roundhouse, and you will see, or you will talk to lawmakers who are saying, yeah, I talked to this person, they're signed on, they get they kind of get excited, and we got this person to sign on this session, and we're almost there. Or you'll overhear people saying, leaders like, you've got the vote, you got to move right now. Time, it's also timing to pass bills. Sorry, I'm getting a little off topic, but I find the legislative process to be extraordinarily
Yeah.
fun.
Do you want to talk about how these fit into this larger kind of modernization initiative? I mean, so now, right now, the newest thing, from my point of view, is the lawmakers now have some paid aides. They have their paid legislative staff, that could help this education process.
Mhm.
But what are some of the other kind of initiatives up there?
We saw one of them, and when we say modernization, this is the one that I observed yesterday at Senate Finance. There's been a push the last 6 or 7 years, I think, to
Mhm.
give lawmakers a salary. We're the only state in the nation that doesn't pay its um, lawmakers a salary. That ranges from, the last time I checked, New Hampshire was like they gave a salary of $100 for their 400 legislators, all the way to California and New York that are paying. I mean, they're full-time legislatures. So there's a large spectrum of what we could pay. So it went before the Senate Finance, which this would establish a commission that would come up with a system or a range or something, of how much to pay legislators, state legislators. Um, and I think the effective date, it would go before the voters in 2028 in the latest iteration. Um, People who follow this issue closely, and this is when we say modernization, this is trying to get New Mexico into more kind of like push it into maybe what other states are doing across the nation, in many ways. Um, People who've covered the legislative salaries know that Senate Finance has been a hurdle for legislative salaries. It made it all through, I think, all the way through the House in the previous year, and got killed in Senate Finance. Well,
Mhm.
yesterday, um, it effectively was not killed, because in the legislature, you're always very careful to talk about something being dead or alive, because some bills can be undead, they can be resurrected. But there was a 5-5 tie in Senate Finance on creating this commission to like come up with a figure to pay salaries and how much it would cost. And a 5-5 tie, um, I will not say that anything is dead, because I've learned the mistake of doing that, but that's a pretty serious challenge. I don't know
Mhm.
that legislative salaries can move this session. And look, there are people who don't like the idea. This is part of the modernization thing, which is like, let's
Mhm.
get, there are people who don't like spending more money on legislators for many reasons. There are people philosophically against this, which is hey, this will, it will remove us. It will sort of create the situation where people run to become professional elected officials. On the other side, there are people who are saying, hey, right now, the legislature is not as diverse as it should be because people who can't afford this can't take a month or 2 months out of the
Right.
year to come up and work, and volunteer.
Right.
There are substantive, ideas on both sides of this debate. I will say that when I got here to New Mexico in 2005, I came from a legislature that already paid folks and they had year-round staff for every lawmaker. So it was sort of an adjustment for me. I think what I came from is more the norm than New Mexico. But it is a substantive debate. So modernization that's just one issue. There, when I say that Matthew McQueen's bills might fit into this modernization, I don't mean the actual package, like the technical package, but
Mhm.
there are people trying to change how the legislature works here in New Mexico.
Right.
And if you look at the history of this, and I want to say too, it came up sorry, back to the legislative salaries. It has been brought up, I think someone said 5 times during the history of New Mexico, and it's never passed. So the last time was 1992, I think, is what was said. So there's a lot of, if people want this to pass, there's a lot of education that has to do not only with lawmakers, but voters. It has to pass
Mhm.
voters because
Right.
this is a constitutional change.
Yeah. So we have a comment from Mary Smith. She says, "I'm an inveterate pessimist." Hi, Mary.
I'm there.
I'm not sure we'll ever be able to fix the New Mexico legislature. I'm probably okay with changing the session lengths, but limiting a legislator to 5 bills is never going to work. What I'd personally like to see is an end to memorials establishing a state corridor or a state question. These waste legislative time. I whine to my legislators that we no longer live in a representative democracy because they never ask the constituents who elected them why issues matter to us. Instead, they listen to lobbyists who give them gifts and perks and listen to their political party.
Another issue here, lobbying. I mean,
There's lobbying bills too, and so we won't get to those today, but we'll try to have a session on the lobbying bills.
I think it's really key that we do, Marjorie. I think
Yeah.
that's really important because honestly, lobbyists have been a part of American democracy since day one. You
Hmm.
can look at some of the history of the Congress and whatnot, and you'll see them. And so they serve a purpose. But Mary knows, because yes, I mean
Yeah.
they're up there.
The lobby, I mean, the New Mexico has a really poor, in my view, it doesn't have much transparency around lobbying.
Right.
So there are bills, every session there are bills to increase the transparency around lobbying, to require more reporting on various things for lobbyists. And it's a big issue. Like, I mean, lobbying is a fact of life. I mean, a lot of people go up there and lobby. They're citizen lobbyists. They don't.
We might have lost Marjorie. I'm not really sure. But I maybe I can continue her thought, which is basically what you will see when you're up at the roundhouse is that you do have citizen lobbyists, people who come up there who are attuned to certain issues and they want to talk to their lawmakers or lawmakers who can change something in the law that affects these constituents. But also what you will find is you do have a class of folks who are paid, and they are paid by various employers who have a lot of resources. And what we have found over the years of looking at the lobbying statute is that New Mexico does not require as much information from lobbyists or the employers who employ lobbyists as other states around the nation. Um, I think maybe on that note, I just wanted to hopefully that I did continue Marjorie's thought there. On that note, maybe it is time to say thank you for coming in. We're at that hour point. Thank you for staying with us, all of you folks, and also thank you for the folks who will later watch um, this Zoom conversation. Marjorie and I really enjoy doing this because we don't get the chance to actually talk about this much, except for among ourselves. And we've had many years of covering the legislature. So we appreciate talking about nerding out somewhat on these Zoom conversations. I hope everyone has a good rest of your week, and we will see you next week. Thanks so much.